The invasion of Ukraine will go down as one of the greatest military boondoggles in modern history. Already the lessons learned are being taught in military academies around the world. But how did Vladimir Putin end up grossly miscalculating his chance to win the war? The war has been raging for 1 year and 3 months as of the writing of this script. Estimates vary wildly, and neither side has any interest in letting real figures out, but moderate estimates for casualties place the war at a total of 70,000 killed and 310,000 wounded. Of those, Russia is believed to have suffered 50,000 dead and 180,000 wounded, giving it the lion's share of the death count. Given Russia's extreme artillery advantage, though, Ukrainian wounded are only about 50,000 behind Russian wounded, despite having less than half the dead. This is because artillery is extremely good at wounding, but not so good at killing entrenched troops. Russia has already suffered nearly as many confirmed KIA as the US did during the entire duration of the Vietnam War, 20 years of direct involvement. In terms of gains, Russia has at best temporarily secured large parts of the separatist East, but has failed to fully consolidate the breakaway republics, which are now, at least according to Russian law, officially part of Russia. The international community, however, does not recognize the illegal annexation of Ukraine's east. In exchange for tenuous control over the Ukrainian breakaway regions, Russia has lost immeasurably more. Over 1,000 Western companies have either fully or at least partially pulled out of Russia, taking a significant amount of investment capital with them, dealing significant damage to the Russian economy. Prices on many goods have doubled or more, though the Russian economy remains relatively stable thanks to a significant war chest Putin had built up over the years for exactly this scenario. The bad news is about half of that $600 billion reserve was frozen at the onset of the war, and the remaining has been steadily draining away as Russia attempts to keep the Russian economy afloat. Exact economic data can be difficult to find as Russia no longer allows for independent verification of its market figures. Instead, Russian officials have been feeding organizations like the IMF their own data, which, much to their discredit, the IMF has happily published without an ounce of skepticism. However, independent analysis of the Russian economy by multiple American and British groups have found an economy in serious trouble, only kept afloat by significant government spending. But its deficit hit a record of $1.8 trillion at the start of this year, with revenues falling by about a third and spending growing by 58%. Russian GDP dropped by between 2.2% or up to 3.9% depending on who you ask, and none who you could ask have been granted access to internal Russian financial data. The true GDP loss could be significantly higher than that, and only expected to continue. Revenues from the export of energy have fallen significantly thanks to a painful European embargo and the imposing of price caps on Russian oil by the EU. This means that nobody using European ships, infrastructure, or any ships or infrastructure insured by a European agency is allowed to purchase oil at a higher price than the $100 a barrel for products that trade at a premium to crude, and $45 for products traded at a discount, such as fuel oil and naphtha. The price cap was not meant to destroy the Russian energy sector, though, and criticism about its ineffectiveness is completely missing the point. Europe wants Russia to continue selling oil, it just doesn't want it making a profit on it. Given the increased distances to ship certain products out of the EU and to foreign markets, as well as the inefficiency of Russian equipment, cost of setting up new trade routes, and infrastructure, Russia is estimated to be at a break-even point on oil revenue. This means it's earning just about as much as it spends on extracting, refining, and shipping, which prompted Russia to begin to tax its oil companies at the price of Brent crude, rather than what its own oil is actually earning. This is obviously unsustainable and will cripple the Russian oil sector for decades as it sucks out funds for expansion, exploration, and basic maintenance. While nations like India and China are greatly benefiting from the deeply discounted oil and thus earning some amount of international ire, a complete boycott would be the exact opposite of what the EU wants. If Russian oil disappeared overnight, it would drive the cost of other oil supplies through the roof, hence why the EU wants Russia to continue selling its energy supplies. Things are still getting worse for Russia, though. The Ukrainian counteroffensive has already begun as of the writing of this script, with shaping operations utilizing HIMARS and Storm Shadow missiles deep behind enemy lines. Ukraine's preparing the battlefield for the coming offensive, and part of that preparation includes helping the Freedom of Russia Legion and Russian Volunteer Corps launch attacks inside of Russia. Multiple times now, both groups have crossed the border from Ukraine into Russia, with their most high-profile attack into Belgorod seeing them occupy multiple villages for 2 days before pulling back. The ongoing raids across the border are brazen and are helping fuel panic amongst Russian population. A subsequent drone swarm attack against Moscow at the end of May fed even more fuel to the fire, as Vladimir Putin was left looking incompetent and incapable of defending his own capital from a drone attack. While the drones weren't armed with high explosives, at least 3 buildings were struck in the wealthy Moscow suburbs, injuring 2 and causing minor damage. The real point of the attack was to erode Russian support for Putin and to incite public anger against the wealthy elite who have leeched off Russian society for decades. When the attacks were announced, the Russians around the country celebrated the fact that they had struck inside the same communities where government and business elite live. Putin is a president up a creek without a paddle. So, how'd he get here? It all began with a botched intelligence assessment of the situation inside of Ukraine before the invasion was launched. Vladimir Putin entrusted his plans to only a few advisors. Fearing leaks and a Western rush to supply Ukraine with arms meant to discourage an invasion, the plan to attack Ukraine was kept secret and only within a very small, tight circle. However, this meant that nobody in the military was prepared. Neither was Russia's intelligence apparatus. As Putin was preparing his invasion, he decided to take the temperature of Ukraine by tasking the FSB to do the job of infiltrating Ukraine and gauging how a Russian invasion would be met. Details remain incredibly murky, but by all accounts, Russian intelligence did not believe Putin would be brazen enough to actually invade. Given the extreme state of the corruption inside of Russia, the intelligence agents assigned this delicate task apparently fabricated their reports, pocketing the millions of rubles assigned to them instead of spending them on their mission. Thus, as Putin reviewed plans to invade Ukraine, he was assured the Ukrainians would meet the Russians as liberators. Famously, the Ukrainians did not, in fact, meet the Russians as liberators. Shockingly, though, Russia's intelligence failure was so bad that even in Ukraine's east, which is the most pro-Russian part of the nation, Putin's forces were met with violence rather than jubilation. The expected collapse of the Ukrainian military did not occur, and while a handful of senior military officers and political officials did cooperate, it was not the flood of insider support that Putin had expected. The approaches to Mariupol had been demined, but the people of Mariupol resisted nonetheless. Russia's second intelligence failure was in properly assessing the state of the Ukrainian military. Many Americans have had some experience training alongside the Ukrainians as part of multiple ongoing missions after the end of the Cold War. One soldier we spoke with described Ukraine's military in the early 2010s as, quote, a complete joke. Discipline was low, facilities were terrible, training was worse, and the soldiers received so little respect that civilian contractors regularly bullied them, even running through a guard post they had erected to serve as a traffic checkpoint. Nobody respected the military because Ukraine's military in the early 2010s still resembled the Russian military of that same era, a husk of its former self from the Soviet days, with corruption rampant and every soldier out for themselves. What Russia's intelligence failed to take note of, though, was that it did not remain that way. After the 2014 invasion of Crimea, NATO stepped up its support for Ukraine, fearing a wider Russian invasion. Along with the support came sweeping reforms, and while today the Ukrainian military continues to struggle with its Soviet roots, thanks to many older officers and NCOs who had their start in the Soviet system, the Ukrainian armed forces are now a capable and competent force. Things aren't perfect, there's still some corruption, and the UAF's military doctrine is lacking in large areas, but Ukraine has proven its military is adaptable and a very quick study of the Western way of war. Russia, however, missed what was taking place right under its own border. It failed to see the restructuring of the Ukrainian military and the professionalism that began to grow in the wake of the 2014 invasion when UAF forces largely cut and run at the sight of Russian tanks. It failed to take note of the battle-hardened veterans it had created through ongoing fighting in the east of the country against Russian-backed separatists. And it failed to note the influx of manned portable anti-tank and air defense weapons along with Western training instructors. When Russia crossed that border into Ukraine, it faced a military that had radically evolved in the last 8 years. In large part, though, Russia's invasion of Crimea helped Putin disastrously miscalculate how the West would respond. As Russian forces poured into Crimea, the West did little to stop Putin. Sanctions were enacted, but these were weak and anemic, with most of Europe leery of angering their #1 energy supplier over a piece of a former Soviet republic. Sanctions would eventually be strengthened, and we would just see how effective sanctions targeting dual-use technology would be as Russia entered into Ukraine with a critical shortage of drones. However, overall, the West's response was tepid at best, even as Moscow fueled an ongoing violent civil war in Ukraine's east. Convinced that the West would respond similarly, Putin was emboldened to invade again, only this time to not take just a piece of the pie but the whole thing. To be fair, he had a good reason to believe the West would once more let him get away with the invasion. America was and continues to be divided politically, in no small part thanks to Russian influence operations. These same influence operations have been ongoing in Europe since the late 2000s and helped fuel Brexit while funneling money to right-wing parties and individuals. Russia's been sowing xenophobia and nationalism in its bid to splinter the EU and the NATO alliance, or at least weaken it and distract it from his schemes in Eastern Europe. This has largely worked, but nobody could predict that rather than fall apart, the US and Europe would come together. Despite continued political division in the US, the nation largely remains united behind support for Ukraine. Europe likewise has been strongly supporting Ukraine, with nations like Poland practically declaring war on Russia on their own as they push every available piece of hardware across the border as quickly as they can. Westerners have grown fat and lazy, too concerned with their own good lives to shoulder any sacrifice, is the thinking of many Chinese political scientists, who believe that the West would crumble if its comfortable way of life was threatened. Putin too believed the same thing, and nobody could have predicted the astonishing speed and severity of sanctions that followed Russia's invasion. Europe, who had been warned by the US to not deepen its energy ties with Russia as it provided Putin leverage, took on the incredibly painful task of severing its energy dependence on Russia, something which would have been unthinkable at the dawn of 2022. Inevitably, though, Putin made the mistake of invading, and very quickly discovered that he had been drinking his own Kool-Aid. Just 2 months before the invasion, major Western publications were publishing articles warning about Russia's, quote, modern and proficient combined arms military. Nobody questioned that Russia had the world's second strongest military, and the thoughts of Russia's combined arms armies crossing the border into the Baltics terrified NATO military planners. We ourselves were drinking that same Kool-Aid alongside the vast majority of analysts and think tanks in the world, publishing a video on how formidable Russia's military had become months before the invasion of Ukraine. In a way, the world can't really be blamed too much for falling for this illusion. Information is tightly controlled inside Russia, and the nation had put on a series of large-scale exercises showing off its combined arms prowess. After the Zapad 2016 exercise, the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency noted that, quote, Russia's forces are becoming more mobile, more balanced, and capable of conducting the full range of modern warfare. What the world missed, however, was that these exercises were highly choreographed, and Russian troops would find that real military operations are a lot harder when someone's actively trying to kill you. Putin, however, also fell for that little lie that the Russian military was a modern and capable force simply because it looked good in an exercise field or on parade. And here he's both at fault but also not to blame. The Russian military is thoroughly corrupt, the depth and scale of which has been kept secret until the invasion of Ukraine. Shortly after crossing the border, the Russian military revealed its rotten core to the world, and it is this systemic corruption that helped fuel Putin's miscalculation. Corruption exists at every level of the military. Young enlisted troops, either volunteers or conscripts, prey on brand new troops, beating and abusing them while stealing everything they can from them, sometimes even forcing them to ask family for more money just so they can steal it. Few NCOs exist because not many conscripts choose to remain to serve as professional soldiers, and NCO training is non-existent in the form known in the West, where new NCOs attend specialized training. What NCOs do exist, though, prey on their underlings as they themselves are preyed upon by their officers. At nearly all levels, though, it is wanton and blatant theft. Troops steal the copper wiring from their own vehicles so they can sell it, and officers steal funds meant for training or equipment upkeep. A common practice in the Russian military is what's known as photo reports. Rather than file a detailed report on unit training goals, status, and results, Russian officers simply take photos of their troops training and send it up the chain. Naturally, this leads to incidents such as an officer taking his troops out to the firing range, having everyone fire a few rounds while he takes a photo or a short video, and then immediately terminating the training. The officer can then pocket all the money not spent on training, while the unit fails to maintain their proficiency or build even basic soldiering skills. Further up the chain, unit commanders falsify records to show their units have more men than they actually have. This is because soldiers' pay is given directly to their unit commander, whose job it is to divvy it among the men. Naturally, the more men in a unit, the more pay that unit will receive, with the commander pocketing the pay of every phantom soldier he lied about in his paperwork. However, most will also skim some right off the top anyway, shorting their own troops. At even higher levels, scams run rampant. One Russian senior officer was imprisoned shortly after the invasion when it was discovered that he had sold hundreds of gallons of fuel meant for his armored vehicles to local villagers. These fuel scams are very common, as well as outright theft of military property such as weapons, ammunition, or ordnance, which can be sold on the black market. At the acquisitions level, corruption is so common, the cost of it is baked into the cost of acquiring new weapons. Russia finds it cheaper to buy Iranian drones, for example, because the built-in cost of bribes and kickbacks make Russian-built drones too expensive to build and buy. This all adds up to a military with a thoroughly rotten core and very little proficiency. Putin, who surrounded himself by yes-men that he can control, was aware of some corruption. Such is the way in Russia, but he had no idea just how poorly prepared his troops were for real combat operations. This is where he is both at fault and not at fault, because while he couldn't have known, it is also his fault that the Russian military is as corrupt as it is. Having perpetuated the same culture of corruption that brought him to power, he should have hardly found it surprising that everyone up the entire chain of command was also enthusiastically engaging in it as well, hollowing out his military forces. Putin believed that he'd be able to take Kyiv in 3 days after seeing the brutal speed of American combined arms operations in Afghanistan and Iraq. However, Putin had miscalculated just how poorly prepared the Russian military was, both in terms of basic competency and logistics. It doesn't help that Putin appears to remain largely blind to the troubled state of his own military, as defectors with close access to the dictator have confirmed that he watches no media except Russian state media, and he doesn't even browse the internet. This means we won't be getting a very special subscriber from the heart of the Kremlin, but on the other hand, that might be a good thing, because the bigger Putin's miscalculations, the faster he ushers in the defeat of the Russian military and his own downfall. Now go check out analyzing Ukraine's next move against Russia, or click this other video instead.